look what followed me home from the thrift store. They had a 50% off sale, so I ended up paying just under $8 for this. For less than the cost of lunch, I got a belt drive turntable, an AM/FM radio tuner, and a double cassette deck. Here it is in the 1992 Radio Shack catalog. It was their cheapest stereo system, the Clarinet 125, for $179.95. Budget-priced performer offers good stereo sound with easy operation, and it fits almost anywhere. Audiophiles often use the term black plastic crap to deride a lot of 1980s and 1990s stereo equipment just because they don't like the way it looks. But in this case, that term is justified because this is made almost entirely out of black plastic and it is very lightweight. At first glance, it appears to have a 3-band graphic equalizer, but that's actually just tone, balance, and volume controls styled to look like an equalizer. Sometimes on cheap stereo systems, at least the sides of the cabinet are made of wood, but not here. It's all plastic. And on the back, you just get RCA speaker outputs and FM antenna terminals with a connection to use the power cord as the antenna. There is no line level aux input. And there, molded into the plastic, it says Realistic Catalog Number 13-1245, custom manufactured in China for Radio Shack. Actually, there is one part of this system that's made of a wood-like material, and that's the bottom cover. And there you can see the date code 9A1 means this was made in September 1991. I have it connected to a pair of bookshelf speakers, which are the unique combination of being both physically significantly smaller than the original speakers this system came with, and also a lot better sounding than the original speakers this came with. I'll start out with the radio tuner. This is FM.
7 degrees. We'll get the 4-day AccuWeather forecast coming.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a line.
John, que él es el muchacho.
Certainly is picking up a lot of stations, and that's just using the line cord as the antenna. Now let's try AM. I noticed this switch is a little touchy. I may need to spray it with some deoxit, because sometimes on AM I only get the left channel unless I jiggle the switch a bit to get both channels.
Time, there's a ton of variables. Every series is gritty and tough and this and that. If Jim...
Found in her.
Hello, this is Mike Huckabee. This would be an incredibly important...
Lisa Oler, Vice President and Commercial...
The elderly, business professionals, it's quite overwhelming.
In recent days. Inez Deliquatera, ABC News, Paris.
The Biden administration pushing for at least a...
Certainly is also picking up a lot of stations, including my favorite one at the top of the dial, which plays a lot of good music. And now I'll give you some direct hookup samples of what it sounds like on both FM and AM.
Everything that rocks.
Mississippi Queen. If you know what I mean. We're the renegades of funk. We're the renegades of funk. Don't need nothing but a good time.
It's 105.5 WDHA.
If you like classic soft rock, look no further than softrockradio.net.
The cassette deck portion of it obviously doesn't have anything fancy like Dolby noise reduction or support for chrome and metal tapes, but of course it does have soft eject doors that open a little bit too slowly, as is common for these cheap double cassette decks. And surprisingly, it still works perfectly fine with original belts. And it's supposed to have full auto stop, which automatically stops when you reach the end of the tape when you're rewinding or fast forwarding. And that does work when you don't have a tape in there. But I can tell those belts are getting a little bit weak because when you do have a tape in and it reaches the end, it doesn't auto stop, which is a sign that the belts are getting a little bit stretched out. As expected, it uses a Tanishin mechanism, or a clone of it, but something you don't normally see on a cheap stereo system is an electromagnetic erase head instead of the typical permanent magnet erase head. I just wish they actually gave it rubber feet so it wouldn't tend to slide around on you when you push the buttons. And I noticed it says continuous play 1 to 2. That's a feature where it can automatically play 2 tapes in sequence. This is deck 1 and this is deck 2, but if you try to use that continuous play feature in the 1 to 2 order they indicated, it doesn't work. You actually have to do it the opposite way. You put your first tape in deck number 2 and your second tape in deck number 1. Then you start playing tape number 2 and you press pause and play on tape number 1, and you'll see what happens when this tape finishes.
Jam presents.
When this one stopped, it released the pause on this deck, allowing you to play those 2 tapes in order. This does not have high-speed dubbing, but it does have synchro start dubbing. That's where you put the tape to be copied in the playback deck and the tape to be recorded onto in the recording deck. You press pause and record on that tape, and as soon as you press play on this tape, it'll automatically release the pause.
Listening to the radio, driving in your car. Radio gets results.
The recordings this thing makes actually sound surprisingly good, at least for a cheap stereo system like this. I'll give you a direct hookup sample of something I recorded from the radio.
Getting you back to what you love.
Today's hits.
I can buy myself flowers. Yesterday's favorite. Magic 98.3.
The record player is basically an older variant of the same kind of turntable mechanism that is used today in cheap suitcase players and all-in-one systems.
I find them really easy to identify. I mean, just look at that. If you see that in the top of something, I would suggest running a mile away from it.
Including an undersized platter that is entirely plastic. It doesn't even have those little rubber nubs for the record to sit on. But it does have a built-in 45 RPM adapter, a feature that I wish new turntables today still had. The turntable mechanism is dampened to absorb vibrations. And it's a good thing I was able to find a copy of the original owner's manual, because it turns out there's a hidden transport screw which you need to pry off the 45 adapter to get to, and the original owner never fully released it. The tone arm is also entirely plastic, and has a ceramic cartridge with a sapphire stylus. That cartridge is a genuine Japanese-made Chu Denshi CZ800 instead of one of the Chinese knockoffs of it that virtually everyone is using these days, and this is almost guaranteed to be the original stylus because it's still the lighter orange color instead of the now familiar red color. And this may look like a counterweight at the end of the tone arm, but it's just an empty plastic housing. There is no counterweight or counterbalance spring inside it. And this cueing lever is undampened, but I'm going to take care of that right now with this damping fluid. Much better. So the descent of the tone arm is more gentle now, but as for how gentle it would be to the grooves of the records you're playing, it tracks at around 6.2 grams, which is a little bit above the 6 gram recommended maximum of both this cartridge and of stereo vinyl records in general. So I wouldn't recommend using this or any cheap turntable to play your most valuable vinyl records, but as long as you keep them clean and replace that stylus like I just did, your records will be fine. It's not going to cause any great damage to them. Enough obsessing over the details. Let's listen to what this record player actually sounds like. Well, obviously the old belt is too stretched out to run the turntable, but that sounds pretty cool. It looks like they actually put some effort into properly balancing the platter, not like the cheap record players sold today, where if it's unbalanced, oh well, you just have to live with it wobbling. And there's our belt, and there's the auto stop mechanism. As I move the tone arm to what would be the beginning of the record, it switches on the motor. And then when it gets to the end of the record in the middle, it moves to shut off the motor until you pick it up and put it back to the rest. I'm going to add a drop of oil to the motor because it's a little bit noisy. Maybe you can't hear it on camera, but it is rattling a little bit. I just added a little bit of 3-in-1 motor oil to the base of the motor shaft, and now it's totally silent. There's the entire turntable mechanism removed. It's a BSR-derived Capetronic mechanism, the ancestor of today's Crosley Victrola type turntable mechanism. The turntable motor was made by Matsushita or Matsushita or however you want to say it. All the circuitry is on one board. There's the built-in AM ferrite bar antenna and tuning capacitor. There's the main radio tuner chip. It's an LA1805. There's another chip here that says 11861 on it. I can't find anything relevant about that, but presumably it has something else to do with the radio tuner. There's the main amplifier chip. I don't know what type it is because it's covered up with this heatsink, but according to the specifications in the owner's manual, it puts out 1.2 watts per channel. And here is a TA7668 preamp chip for the tape recorder, including automatic level control for the recording. And there is the recording playback switch and recording bias oscillator. And this is another chip for the tape recorder, the BA3402 preamp for playback. And do you recognize that logo? That means at least the circuitry, if not the entire stereo system, was made for Radio Shack by Sanyo. And as typical for cheap double cassette decks, both decks run off a single motor hiding behind the circuit board here, but they do have metal flywheels. Servicing the belts is annoyingly complicated by the fact that they solder these wires directly in the middle of one of them. I hate when they do that. So I left that one in place and took out the 3 remaining belts, which could be removed without obstruction. And as you can see, they all have gone a bit egg-shaped. The cassette deck motor was made by Mitsumi, and I also want to oil it because with no belts attached to it, you can hear how noisy it is. I guess it is a little quieter now, but not as much as I had hoped. And I'm lucky I have spare parts because when I was working on this mechanism, I heard some little parts go flying, and it was the same part of the pause mechanism that I did a video about a while back, this white plastic post and a spring underneath it. That plastic tends to crack, and then when you push the button on the cassette deck, this pops off and often gets lost, so I had to replace it with one from a newer mechanism where this cap is not cracked and it will stay in place now. All of these belts really should be replaced, and I've measured them in case I need to. But first I'm going to try the old trick of boiling the belts. That's exactly what it sounds like. You drop the belts into a pot of boiling water for about 5 minutes. Okay, that's long enough. I reinstalled the boiled belts, and the deck with that one belt I was not able to remove still does not auto stop on rewind or fast forward. but the other deck now does. So that's an improvement. But I did need to replace the turntable belt because even after boiling it, it was still playing too slowly. So boiling the belts is not some magic cure-all fix. It can help if the belts are only a little bit loose, but if they're really stretched out like this one was, you'll still need to replace it. So now finally the turntable's working properly, and I'll give you some direct hookup samples of what it sounds like. I think this is a good example of how these cheap plastic record player mechanisms that they're still using today in record players from brands like Crosley and Victrola don't need to sound bad. Obviously, they're never going to deliver high fidelity sound, but they could sound a lot better than they do today if they just used a good quality motor, a genuine Chuodenshi cartridge instead of one of those cheap $2 Chinese knockoffs, and they actually connected it to a good quality, properly impedance matched amplifier and a lot better speakers than what they're putting in those little suitcase players. This Realistic Clarinet 125 stereo system from 1991 really exceeded my expectations, because one look at this cheap black plastic and the fact that it was Radio Shack's least expensive stereo system at the time, made at the time when CDs were taking over and vinyl was almost dead and even cassettes were starting to fall out of favor, but yet they managed to pull off a good sounding record player, a good sounding cassette deck, an overall entirely respectable performance. But the people designing systems like this today and putting names like Crosley and Victrola on it, they grew up when people were listening to iPods and Discmans, so they never had any experience with cassette tapes and records when they were a kid, so they probably don't know how good cassette tapes and records can sound. So they slap together a bunch of cheap components and they think, well, that's just how these formats sound. These old, obsolete, noisy, scratchy, hissy formats, that's just how they're supposed to sound. They don't know any better. But the people who made this back in the early 90s, they did know better. And that's really just a sad fact of how much knowledge and experience we've lost since then. And hopefully someday we can regain before it's too late.